Joining us now, NBC's Garrett Haake, Matthew Dowd, chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney 2004 presidential race, and Tom Dupree, former deputy assistant attorney general under George W. Bush. Garrett, there have been more than 40 lawsuits now against the Trump administration on a different number of his executive orders. How are officials inside the White House treating this pushback they're getting from the courts?
And more added every day, perhaps even every hour, Jose. I think these lawsuits have become perhaps the most effective brake on the Trump administration, because even if they ultimately, these plaintiffs ultimately lose, they are at least slowing down elements of the Trump agenda. And that's the way the White House looks at it, that these are speed bumps. They believe that they will ultimately win most of these cases, though especially the ones that they say deal with executive authority that should rightly be used by the executive. And while there may be individual district court judges who disagree with their assessment, they think through the appeals process, even if it takes getting to the Supreme Court, they'll ultimately win. But there is frustration inside this building that the elements of the president's agenda aren't able to move as quickly as he wants, particularly when it comes to reshaping the federal government through Doge and Elon Musk and those other efforts that are really testing exactly how far the executive can go in controlling what goes on here in official Washington.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, how do you see this? I mean, what do you define as a constitutional crisis, and is that what we're seeing now?
Well, I don't think we've quite reached that point yet. Look, there's always going to be some tension between an executive that attempts to exert his power, especially at the new administration, and getting pushback from the courts. We saw that under all presidents, under Obama, under Biden, in the first Trump administration. We're seeing it now. I think the real question will be what happens when, as seems inevitable, the president loses a lot of these cases. Will he comply with the orders, or will he refuse to comply? I think if we're in a world where he's refusing to comply, then at that point, I would say there are serious constitutional concerns raised. Traditionally, the way we resolve these disputes under our legal system is you may not like the decision of a judge, but that doesn't give you an excuse not to comply with his or her order. Rather, what you do is you challenge that on appeal, you go all the way up to the Supreme Court if necessary, but at the end of the day, you abide by the rulings of the federal courts.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, in response to some of these legal obstacles, Vice President J.D. Vance posted on social media, judges are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. How do you see it, and what is the executive's legitimate power vis-a-vis the courts?
Well, I think the executive's legitimate power does fall. There is a core. I mean, the vice president is right. There's a core universe of executive powers, such as conducting military operations, that judges shouldn't get involved in. And I think he's right there. But in the event the judges disagree, in the event the judges issue a ruling that the president thinks infringes on his power, as I said a minute ago, the remedy lies in appealing that decision, fighting your way to the Supreme Court to get a definitive ruling. It does not rely or does not end in simply declining to follow what the court is telling you to do.
Yeah, Matthew, I mean, recent polling shows that this one by CBS News, that over half of adults approve of the president's job performances so far. And 7 in 10 say he is doing what he promised during the campaign. How is this playing outside of Washington?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised at that, because I don't think that his actions as of yet have filtered down to the sort of average voter that says, how has my life been negatively impacted by what is going on? I mean, obviously, all of us can have a discussion about what this means for our Constitution and for our democracy. But until that filters down in that, I think the president is following through, which many people think is a bad thing, that he's following through on all the things that he warned us about that he was going to do in the course of this. But I think as of right now, until it really negatively impacts, and not just a warning that it could happen, but it actually happens to the voters, I think he's going to maintain those numbers. And he's really bolstered in those numbers, Jose, by the 93% of Republicans approve of Donald Trump today, which is an amazing number to have. It's higher than it was in his first term, even with all the things he's done related to the Constitution, executive power, and all of that.
What do you think that's due? Why do you think that number is where it is?
Well, I think we're at a time where and the conversation, I think, is really important on whether or not we're in a constitutional crisis right now, which is, I agree with Tom, we're not there yet. But I think we're in a constitutional rot situation. And the constitutional rot situation, which means pillars of our democracy and our Constitution are decaying and have been decaying for a long time. The problem is the polarization that exists in the United States. And what is developed is this ends justify the means approach to the Republican Party. And the thought that they are abdicating any responsibility on checks and balances and advice and consent in the Senate and actually approving people that are objectively not competent to be running certain departments in here and who wholly may be unfit in character in this. And as we have that sort of attitude of Republicans officials is filtered down to voters, which is it doesn't matter what happens in, with these sorts of things. We're going to get what we want no matter who is hurt, no matter what is punished, and no matter the effects on our Constitution. But I would say that we're in a moment today that has been, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a long time in coming when these pillars of our democracy have been deteriorating. We just so happen to have a president who's willing to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I want to bring in Ashley Parker, staff writer at The Atlantic. Ashley, it's great seeing you. What do you think this back and forth between the White House and some of the federal courts tell us about how the administration sees itself and its ability to use and to the executive authority given to it to govern?
Well, the administration clearly sees itself as above the judicial branch. And if you look at some of these quite explicit comments that President Trump and Vice President Vance are making, they are not necessarily, maybe with one exception where the judge has ruled that they were not abiding by his order to halt the freeze of federal funds. They have not yet run roughshod over rulings they've disagreed with, but they are very publicly, in terms of their messaging, setting the stage to potentially do as much and sort of priming the American electorate and certainly their base to say, why do judges have all this power? A judge shouldn't be able to, tell the executive what we can or cannot do. These judges are activists. And so, again, they are laying and we don't know quite what they will do, but they are very clearly laying the groundwork to potentially disregard some of these rulings, at least from the lower courts that they disagree with, and kind of say, well, as J.D. Vance said, the judges ruled, are the judges going to enforce it? So try to stop me. And that is what they're very clearly, overtly messaging right now.
Yeah, and then no doubt that the term, magistrates that are not working only on judicial principles but have political aspirations or at least underpinnings is something that we've been hearing for the longest time. Matthew, I'm just wondering about when you're talking about the whole political rot and the constitutional rot. This is something that we've been saying and seeing, I should say, for years now.
Yeah, it's decades in the making. I mean, you could trace it back, and Tom could add to this, but you could trace it back to the sort of War Powers Act, that there's been an assertion of executive power over the last 50 years or so, and there hasn't been enough pushback by the Congress and the Senate and the House to say, no, that's too far in executive powers. Because of polarization, because of partisanship, they basically support a president if he does what they want him to do in the course of this. And now we've reached the point where we're not even having separation of powers. The Senate, the Republicans in the Senate seem to just say, you can do whatever you want. We're not even going to fulfill our role. And the checks and balances that has existed that tried to prevent this, and many of our founders warned about this more than 200 years ago, the proliferation of executive orders, which I think has gotten out of hand and is way too much of an assertion of an executive power in the course of this. And it's step by step by step by step. And there wasn't enough pushback along the way over the last 20, 30, 40 years to sort of stop a president. And you have somebody like Donald Trump who arrives back in the Oval Office who is willing to take advantage of the cracks that we have in those pillars. And if he takes, as Tom said, if it goes too far, those pillars are going to fall. And our constitutional democracy could end up in ruins.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, the issue of the executive orders, and if you look back in history, executive orders have been utilized to create all kinds of things, even departments that later become part of the national, I guess, reality. I'm just wondering, Tom, and I'm thinking a lot about, for example, like when President Obama had to deal with, he created DACA, and that was immediately challenged in the courts. that was able to survive, even though today, as we speak, that is a program that is threatened. But he wasn't able to fulfill his creation of DAPA because that was stopped. And so I'm just wondering, Tom, where do court rulings and executive decisions eventually clash?
Yeah, and it is interesting, and Matthew's absolutely right, that there has been a gradual increase in presidents looking to executive orders to enact policy rather than through the old-fashioned process of passing legislation through Congress. They're doing it because we're obviously in a politically gridlocked situation where Congress, for whatever reason, has not been exercising its institutional responsibility to legislate. And presidents of all stripes, all parties, love executive orders because they can just do something and enact policy with the stroke of a pen. That's why it's so attractive to them. And in fact, just speaking kind of from a conservative perspective, one of the real protections that conservatives had against executive overreach under Biden and Obama were the federal courts, who would step in and say, look, we may or may not like this as a policy matter, Mr. President, but you can't enact this through executive order. And so I think that's one of the real questions that we're going to see unfold in the next year or two, is whether courts continue to exercise their historical oversight role of policing and reining in executive branch overreach.